At dinner, he destroyed my love with words. I destroyed his world with evidence. Hi, everyone. Before we get into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel's reach has been dropping a bit, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, free, and helps us keep bringing you new and interesting stories. Your support means the world to us, and together we can grow this channel. Thank you so much. Now let's get to today's story. I'm writing from a temporary account for obvious reasons, and I've changed some details to protect my anonymity. You know, there's a moment in every woman's life when she realizes, that's it, the end, the point of no return. For me, that moment happened at our dinner table in the kitchen overlooking the park, under the Murano glass chandelier we'd chosen together 7 years ago, when it still mattered what I thought about anything. But let me start from the beginning, because every ending deserves its proper prologue. I met David at a corporate retreat in Colorado, one of those mandatory team-building weekends where everyone pretends to care about synergy while secretly planning their escape routes. I was 28, a marketing manager with a corner office and a 5-year plan that included everything except falling for a charming stranger who quoted Hemingway over terrible conference coffee. He was different then. God, he was so different. David had this way of listening, really listening, that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. When I told him about my dream of opening my own consultancy, he didn't patronize me with, "That's nice," or change the subject to sports. Instead, he asked questions, real questions. What kind of clients would I target? How would I differentiate myself? What scared me most about taking the leap? Fear is just excitement without breath, he said, stirring sugar into his coffee with the same precision he'd later use to measure out my inadequacies. You just need to remember to breathe. I should have paid attention to how he dismissed the other woman at our table, Sarah from accounting, when she tried to join our conversation. The way his smile turned polite but cold, how he answered her questions with monosyllables until she drifted away. But I was 28 and drunk on possibility, and when someone like David Hartwell, 6'2", MBA from Wharton, eyes like winter mornings, chooses you, you don't question the selection process. Our first real date was at Chez Laurent, that overpriced French place downtown where the wine list costs more than most people's rent. David ordered for both of us. "Trust me," he said with that smile that made my knees forget their primary function. And I let him. I actually found it charming then. This take charge attitude. Confident, masculine, protective. "I like a woman who's accomplished but not threatening," he told me over the creme brulee we shared. "Someone with her own ambitions but who understands that relationships require balance." I laughed and told him I wasn't the threatening type. Another thing I'd regret later, but at the time it felt like the right answer. The answer that kept his attention, that earned me a second date, a third, that weekend in Martha's Vineyard where he first said he loved me while we watched the sunrise from his family's deck. The proposal came a 1.5 years later, in the same restaurant where he'd first explained what kind of woman he preferred. The ring was magnificent. 2 carats, princess cut, set in platinum, and every woman in the restaurant turned to stare when he dropped to one knee beside our table. I said yes before he finished asking the question, tears streaming down my face, completely overwhelmed by the fairy tale unfolding around me. "I knew you were special from the moment I met you," he whispered as he slipped the ring onto my finger. "You're going to make me so happy, Claire. We're going to have such a beautiful life together." And for a while, we did. The wedding was everything I dreamed of as a little girl playing dress-up in my mother's closet. 200 guests at the Ritz-Carlton, flowers flown in from Holland, a dress that cost more than my first car. David looked like a movie star in his tuxedo, and when he lifted my veil to kiss me, I truly believed we were starring in our own romantic comedy. The first year of marriage felt like an extended honeymoon. David was attentive, romantic, successful. He'd been promoted to senior partner at his law firm, and I was finally ready to launch my consulting business. We bought the house on Maple Street. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a kitchen that belonged in Architectural Digest, and that view of Meridian Park that made everything feel possible. I remember the day we moved in, how David carried me over the threshold like we were newlyweds all over again. How we made love on the hardwood floors because the movers hadn't delivered our bed yet. Afterward, lying there wrapped in his arms with the afternoon sunlight streaming through our new windows, I thought, this is it. This is what happiness looks like. We should have a housewarming party, I suggested, tracing patterns on his chest. Invite everyone. Show off our beautiful new home. Our home, he corrected, kissing the top of my head. But yes, we should celebrate. You deserve to show off a little. The party was a success. 40 of our closest friends and colleagues catered appetizers, wine that David selected personally from the cellar he was building in the basement. I wore the black cocktail dress he'd bought me for our anniversary. You look stunning in this, he'd said, but maybe save it for special occasions. It's a bit much for every day. And played the perfect hostess while David held court in the living room, regaling everyone with stories about his latest case. You're so lucky. My friend Jennifer whispered to me in the kitchen as I refreshed the cheese platter. David absolutely adores you. The way he looks at you. It's like you're the center of his universe. I glowed at her words, at the validation that our love story was as perfect as it appeared from the outside. But even then, if I'm being honest, there were tiny cracks beginning to show. The way David introduced me to his colleagues. This is my wife, Claire. She does some marketing work. The subtle correction when I mentioned my business plans to his boss. Claire's exploring some options, but we haven't decided anything yet. The way he'd steer conversations away from my achievements and toward his own. But I told myself these were just growing pains. Marriage was about compromise, about learning to function as a team rather than two individuals. David was the breadwinner, the one with the established career, the connections, the reputation. It made sense that his professional life would take precedence, especially in social situations. I was still so naive then. Still believed that love was enough to bridge any gap, smooth over any rough edge. Still thought that being chosen was the same thing as being valued. The changes started small. The way cancer starts with a single corrupted cell. A comment here, a suggestion there, each one reasonable in isolation, but poisonous in accumulation. That presentation you gave at the Morrison meeting was a bit intense, David said one evening as we shared a bottle of wine on our back deck. I could see how it might come across as aggressive to some people. I'd spent weeks preparing for that presentation, my first major pitch as an independent consultant. The client had loved it, signed a 6-month contract on the spot, but all I could focus on was David's criticism. I wasn't trying to be aggressive, I said, swirling the Merlot in my glass. I was just passionate about the project. Of course, and passion is wonderful. But you know how men can be in business settings. They're not always comfortable with strong personalities in women. I'm just saying, maybe dial it back a notch next time. Let your work speak for itself. Let your work speak for itself. As if enthusiasm was a character flaw. As if caring too much was something to be ashamed of. But David was successful, respected, and he'd been in the business world longer than I had. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was coming on too strong. The next critique came a month later when I'd gained 5 pounds and he noticed. Have you been stress eating? He asked as I reached for a second piece of garlic bread at dinner. You know how bloated you get when you eat too much bread? The comment stung, but he said it with such casual concern, as if he was looking out for my well-being rather than criticizing my appearance. I put the bread down and spent the rest of the meal picking at my salad while David enjoyed his meal with obvious satisfaction. I'm not trying to be mean, he said later, finding me staring at myself in our bedroom mirror, pinching the soft flesh around my waist. I love you exactly as you are. I just want you to be happy with yourself. But I wasn't happy with myself. Not anymore. The woman in the mirror looked tired, uncertain, somehow smaller than the confident marketing executive who'd caught David's attention 3 years ago. When had I started second-guessing every bite of food, every word in every presentation, every opinion I voiced at dinner parties? The transformation was so gradual I barely noticed it happening. One day I was a successful professional with my own dreams and ambitions, and the next I was a wife who apologized for taking up too much space, who checked with David before making social plans, who found herself saying, "We think," instead of "I think," even when he wasn't around. My consulting business, which had started so promisingly, began to flounder as my confidence eroded. Clients who'd once praised my innovative thinking now seemed skeptical of my suggestions. Networking events became exercises in anxiety as I second-guessed every interaction, every pitch, every attempt to promote my services. "Maybe it's time to consider other options," David suggested one evening after I'd lost another potential client to a competitor. "The market is so saturated right now. You're incredibly talented, but maybe your talents would be better utilized in a more stable environment." "You mean get a job?" I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "I mean, be practical. We have a mortgage, car payments, responsibilities. My income can support us both, but it would be nice to have some additional security. And honestly, Claire, you seem stressed all the time. Maybe the entrepreneur life isn't for you." Maybe the entrepreneur life isn't for you. As if entrepreneurship was a lifestyle choice rather than a calling, as if my dreams were hobbies I could abandon when they became inconvenient. But our bank account was dwindling, and David was right about the stress. I hadn't slept well in months, and my confidence was at an all-time low. 2 weeks later, I accepted a position as a marketing coordinator at a mid-sized firm downtown. The salary was decent but uninspiring, the work routine but stable. David took me out to celebrate at our old favorite restaurant. "I'm so proud of you," he said, raising his glass of champagne in a toast. "Sometimes the mature choice is the hardest one to make." I smiled and clinked my glass against his, but the champagne tasted flat on my tongue. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered that this wasn't victory. It was surrender. But I silenced that voice the way I'd learned to silence all the inconvenient voices in my head, and told myself that David was right. This was the mature choice. The practical choice. The choice a good wife would make. With my professional dreams safely neutralized, David's attention turned to other aspects of my life that required his guidance. My friendships, for instance, needed curating. "I don't understand what you see in Jessica," he said after one of my college friends visited for the weekend. "She's so dramatic. And the way she talks about her divorce, it's like she's proud of giving up on her marriage." Jessica wasn't dramatic. She was vivacious, and she hadn't given up on her marriage. She'd escaped from an abusive relationship with her sanity and her children intact. But explaining this would mean defending Jessica's choices, which would seem like criticism of David's opinion, which had become an increasingly dangerous territory in our house. "She's been through a lot," I said carefully. "The divorce was really hard on her." "I'm sure it was, but don't you think it might be better to limit your exposure to that kind of negativity? You're so sensitive, Claire. You absorb other people's energy. Maybe spend less time with friends who are going through difficult periods." One by one, my friendships began to wither, not through any dramatic confrontations, but through the slow strangulation of inconvenience. Jessica was too negative. Sandra was too competitive. Maria was too opinionated. Even Jennifer, who'd envied our perfect marriage at the housewarming party, eventually stopped calling after David made it clear that her frequent visits were disruptive to our quiet time together. "Couples need space to grow," he explained after Jennifer's last awkward departure. "Too much outside influence can be toxic to a relationship." I told myself he was right. We were building something special, something that required protection from external forces. But the house on Maple Street began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a carefully constructed cage, beautiful and comfortable, but increasingly isolated from the outside world. My family received similar treatment, though David was more subtle in his approach. My parents lived 6 hours away in Pennsylvania, and what had once been monthly visits gradually stretched to quarterly, then twice a year, then only major holidays. "Your mother is so exhausting," David would say after my parents left. "All those questions about our plans, our finances, our future. It's like being interrogated. She's just interested in our lives. I'd protest weakly. Interested or intrusive? There's a difference, Claire. And your father just sits there saying nothing. I don't understand what we're supposed to get out of these visits. What we were supposed to get out of them was love, support, connection to something larger than our increasingly small world. But David had a way of making my family's genuine concern seem like meddling. Their affection seem like obligation. Gradually, I began to see them through his eyes. My mother's questions became pushiness. My father's quiet presence became disengagement. My sister's success in her career became a subtle criticism of my own choices. The isolation was so complete, so carefully orchestrated, that I didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. I was like a frog in slowly boiling water, the temperature rising so gradually that I never thought to jump out. At work, I kept my head down and did my job competently but without enthusiasm. My colleagues were pleasant enough, but David had made it clear that office friendships often led to complications. Work is work, he'd say. Home is home. Smart people don't blur those boundaries. So I came home every evening to our beautiful house and my handsome husband and our carefully curated life and told myself I was lucky. Lucky to have a man who cared enough to offer guidance. Lucky to have financial security and a gorgeous home and a husband who still opened doors for me and bought me flowers on my birthday. But luck, I was learning, could feel surprisingly similar to suffocation. By our 4th year of marriage, David's control over my life was nearly complete, though he'd managed it with such skillful manipulation that I barely recognized it as control at all. Every restriction was presented as protection, every criticism as concern, every limitation as loving guidance. I've been thinking, he said one Saturday morning as we shared coffee and the newspaper on our sun-drenched breakfast nook. Maybe it's time we started trying for children. Not, maybe we should discuss starting a family, or how do you feel about having kids? Just a unilateral decision presented as a collaborative thought. I looked up from the arts section, startled by both the suggestion and the casual way he'd delivered it. Children? Now? Why not? We're financially stable, we have the house, we're both in our 30s. It's the logical next step. The logical next step. As if our entire life together was a series of predetermined moves on a chessboard, each one inevitable and carefully calculated. I'd always wanted children, but not like this. Not as items to be checked off a list, but as an expression of love so overwhelming that we couldn't imagine our future without them. I'd like to discuss it, I said. Think about timing, make sure we're both ready. David's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, though I'm not sure what there is to discuss. We're married, we love each other, we're financially secure. What other factors are relevant? What other factors were relevant? My career, for one. My dreams of maybe starting my consulting business again someday. My desire to travel, to grow, to become the woman I was meant to be before I got lost in being the woman David wanted me to be. But saying any of this would open a conversation I wasn't ready to have, because it would force me to admit what I'd been pretending not to know for months. I wasn't happy. Our marriage wasn't the fairy tale I'd convinced myself it was, and the life we'd built together felt more like a prison than a partnership. You're right, I said instead, folding the newspaper with hands that shook slightly. Let's start trying. 6 months later, I was pregnant with Emma. David was over the moon, already making plans for her nursery, her education, her future. He'd transformed one of our guest bedrooms into a Pinterest-perfect baby sanctuary, complete with a crib that cost more than most people's cars and a glider where I was expected to spend countless hours in maternal bliss. You're glowing, everyone said. And I smiled and accepted their congratulations while privately wondering why I felt more trapped than radiant. Pregnancy should have been the happiest time of my life, but instead it felt like the final lock clicking into place on my cage. David was solicitous during my pregnancy, almost obsessively so. He monitored my diet, my exercise, my sleep schedule with the dedication of a personal trainer crossed with a security guard. When I mentioned wanting to continue working after the baby was born, he looked at me as if I'd suggested taking up bungee jumping. Why would you want to work? he asked. "We don't need the money, and Emma will need her mother. Daycare is so impersonal, Claire. Don't you want what's best for our daughter?" Of course I wanted what was best for Emma, but what was best for Emma wasn't necessarily what was best for me. And somewhere in the fog of pregnancy hormones and David's gentle but relentless pressure, I lost sight of the distinction entirely. Emma was born on a Tuesday in March after 18 hours of labor that David documented with the obsessive precision of a war correspondent. She was perfect. Tiny pink fingers, eyes like her father's, a cry that could shatter glass and somehow always did so at 3 a.m. I loved her immediately and completely, with a fierce protectiveness that surprised me with its intensity. But love, I discovered, could coexist with a bone-deep exhaustion that made every day feel like swimming through molasses. David hired a night nurse for the first month, but after that I was on my own with Emma's feeding schedule, her sleep regressions, her inexplicable colic episodes that lasted for hours. "You're such a natural mother," David would say when he came home from work to find me still in my pajamas, milk-stained and hollow-eyed from another sleepless night. "Emma is so lucky to have you." But he'd say this while scrolling through his phone, not offering to help with the evening routine or take over the 2 a.m. feeding or give me a break to shower and remember what it felt like to be human. His compliments felt increasingly like consolation prizes for a life I'd never consciously chosen. My maternity leave stretched into a permanent exit from the workforce. "Just for now," David assured me. "While Emma is small, you can always go back to work later." Later became a moving target, always just out of reach. Emma needed consistency. Emma needed her mother. Emma would be starting school soon and would need someone to be available for drop-offs and pickups and school events. There was always a reason why later wasn't quite yet. I found myself living for the brief moments when Emma napped and the house was quiet enough for me to remember who I used to be. I'd sit in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and stare out at Meridian Park, watching other people's lives unfold beyond my window, wondering when I'd become a spectator to my own existence. The veneer of respectful partnership began to crack around Emma's second birthday. David had always been controlling, but he'd wrapped his dominance in such elegant packaging that I'd mistaken it for love. Now, secure in his position as provider and patriarch, he began to let the mask slip. It started with small things. Interrupting me when I spoke at dinner parties, correcting my stories with a patronizing smile, making decisions about our social calendar without consulting me, then acting surprised when I mentioned I might have had other plans. "You don't have other plans," he said one evening when I protested about a business dinner he'd scheduled without telling me. "What other plans could you possibly have?" The dismissiveness in his tone was breathtaking. What other plans could I possibly have? As if my life was so empty, so devoid of purpose or interest, that the idea of me having independent social commitments was absurd. "I might have wanted to see a movie," I said quietly, "or have coffee with someone, or just have an evening to myself." David laughed, actually laughed as if I'd told a particularly amusing joke. "Claire, you have every evening to yourself. I work 12-hour days while you're home playing with Emma. If anything, I should be the one complaining about not having time for movies." Playing with Emma, as if caring for a toddler was an extended playdate rather than the physically and emotionally demanding job it actually was. As if managing a household, scheduling Emma's pediatrician appointments, doing the grocery shopping and meal planning and laundry and all the invisible labor that kept our family functioning was somehow less valuable than his billable hours. But arguing would only make things worse, and Emma was sleeping peacefully upstairs, and sometimes keeping the peace felt more important than standing up for principles. I was no longer sure I had the right to claim. The criticism became more direct after that, less carefully wrapped in concern and more openly dismissive. My cooking was too bland, too spicy, too experimental, too boring. My appearance needed work. Had I considered highlights? Maybe a personal trainer? That dress was flattering, but perhaps something more age-appropriate next time. "I'm not trying to be mean," he'd always add after delivering these assessments. "I just want you to be the best version of yourself." But the best version of myself, according to David, bore little resemblance to the woman I'd been before I met him. She was quieter, more accommodating, perpetually grateful for his guidance and support. She never disagreed with his opinions or challenged his decisions. She was perfectly content to live in his shadow, to derive her identity entirely from her roles as his wife and Emma's mother. I began to avoid mirrors, not because I was ashamed of how I looked, but because I was terrified of what I might see. Or rather, what I might not see. The confident, ambitious woman who'd once quoted her own press releases was disappearing, replaced by someone I barely recognized. A nervous, apologetic creature who asked permission to buy groceries and apologized for having opinions. Emma, meanwhile, was growing into a delightful, precocious child who filled our house with laughter and chaos in equal measure. She was my one source of uncomplicated joy, the single aspect of my life that David couldn't criticize or control. When I played with her, really played, not the performance of motherhood David sometimes witnessed, I remembered glimpses of who I used to be. Mama's silly. Emma would giggle when I made ridiculous faces or invented stories about her stuffed animals. In those moments, I felt alive in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. But David didn't appreciate silly. He preferred Emma to be well-behaved, quiet during his phone calls, clean and presentable when his colleagues visited. He loved her. I never doubted that. But he loved her the way he loved everything else. Conditionally, based on how well she reflected his vision of perfection. She's getting a bit wild. He'd say when Emma had what I considered normal toddler moments, tantrums in the grocery store, refusing to put on shoes, testing boundaries the way all children do. Maybe it's time to consider some discipline. Discipline, in David's vocabulary, meant control. Structure. The systematic elimination of any behavior that inconvenienced him or embarrassed him or reminded him that children are human beings rather than accessories. I began to see our family through his eyes. Emma and I were supporting players in the drama of his life, expected to enhance his reputation and reflect his values while never upstaging him or requiring too much attention. We were his beautiful wife and adorable daughter, proof of his success and desirability, but we weren't allowed to be complex or demanding or fully human. The realization was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant admitting that the life I'd built was founded on a fundamental lie. Liberating because once you see the cage, you can start looking for the key. Our 7th wedding anniversary fell on a rainy Thursday in November. David made reservations at Le Bernardin, the same restaurant where we'd had our first anniversary dinner, back when I still believed in the significance of romantic gestures. We should celebrate, he announced over breakfast, not asking if I wanted to celebrate or how I might want to mark the occasion. 7 years is a milestone. A milestone. Like our marriage was a construction project with measurable benchmarks rather than a living relationship that required nurturing and growth. But I nodded and arranged for my mother to babysit Emma, and spent the afternoon trying to decide what to wear for a celebration I didn't feel like having. I chose the black dress David had bought me for our housewarming party, the one he'd said was too much for every day but perfect for special occasions. It still fit, though it felt different now. Tighter in some places, looser in others, as if my body had rearranged itself around the weight of my disappointment. David looked handsome in his navy suit, the silver at his temples adding dignity to his already impressive presence. He was the kind of man other women noticed, the kind who commanded respect in restaurants and boardrooms alike. I could see the hostess at Le Bernardin responding to his charm, the way her smile became more genuine when he thanked her for seating us at our preferred table. "You look beautiful," he told me as we settled into our booth. And for a moment I almost believed him. Almost remembered what it felt like to be desired rather than merely tolerated. The evening started pleasantly enough. David was in a good mood, full of stories about his latest case and plans for his next promotion. I listened and smiled and asked appropriate questions, playing the part of the supportive wife with the skill of long practice. It was over the main course, his sea base, my risotto that I was picking at without enthusiasm, that he made his announcement. "I've been thinking," he said, cutting his fish with surgical precision. "It's time we had another baby. Another baby. Not Would you like another child? Or, how do you feel about expanding our family? Just another unilateral decision delivered with the casual authority of someone who'd never doubted his right to make such choices. Another baby? I repeated, my fork suspended halfway to my mouth. Emma's almost 3. The gap is getting too wide. And honestly, Claire, I think another child would be good for you. Give you more purpose, more focus. You seem restless lately. Restless. As if my growing dissatisfaction with our marriage was a minor personality quirk, rather than a fundamental incompatibility between who I was and who he needed me to be. I'm not sure I'm ready for another baby, I said carefully. David's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Ready? What's there to be ready for? You're already a mother. The infrastructure is in place. It's just a matter of expanding production. Expanding production. As if I was a factory rather than a human being. As if pregnancy and childbirth and the first exhausting years of a child's life were manufacturing processes, rather than transformative experiences that demanded everything I had to give. I'd like to think about it, I said. Maybe wait until Emma starts school. Maybe consider going back to work part-time first. Work? David's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. Claire, let's be realistic. What kind of work are you going to do? You've been out of the game for 3 years. Your skills are obsolete. Your contacts have moved on. What company is going to hire a 35-year-old marketing coordinator with a 3-year gap in her resume? The cruelty of his assessment took my breath away. Not because it was untrue, though it wasn't entirely accurate, but because of the satisfaction in his voice as he delivered it. He was enjoying this, I realized. Enjoying the way my face crumpled, the way my shoulders curved inward as if I could physically protect myself from his words. You could update your skills, I said weakly. Take some courses online. With what time? Between chasing after Emma and managing the household and all your other responsibilities? Claire, be practical. Your job is being my wife and Emma's mother, and you're good at it. When you're not having these little flights of fancy about being a career woman again. Flights of fancy. As if my dreams of professional fulfillment were children's games rather than legitimate aspirations. As if the woman who'd once run successful marketing campaigns and pitched million-dollar accounts was now incapable of anything more challenging than meal planning and diaper changes. I used to be good at other things, too, I said quietly. Used to be, David agreed, spearing another piece of fish. But that was then. This is now. And now your priority should be our family, our future children, the life we've built together. The life he'd built using me as raw material. The future he'd planned, with me as a supporting player. The family that existed primarily to showcase his success and reflect his values. I excused myself to the ladies' room and stood in front of the mirror, staring at the woman looking back at me. She was still recognizably me. Same hazel eyes, same stubborn chin, same freckle just above her left eyebrow. But there was something different about her expression. Something I hadn't seen in years. Anger. Pure, clean, righteous anger that cut through the fog of self-doubt and people-pleasing that had clouded my vision for so long. I was angry at David for his arrogance and cruelty. Angry at myself for allowing it. Angry at the years I'd wasted trying to be someone I wasn't for someone who didn't even see me clearly enough to miss who I really was. But anger, I was learning, could be a gift. It could burn away everything that wasn't essential. Everything that wasn't true. Until all that remained was the irreducible core of who you actually were. I walked back to our table with my spine a little straighter, my smile a little sharper. It was Emma's cough that led to my liberation, though I didn't know it at the time. She'd been fighting a persistent respiratory infection for weeks, and our pediatrician had finally recommended seeing a specialist. David was in court all day, so I took her to the appointment alone, grateful for something to do that felt purposeful and necessary. Dr. Rodriguez was thorough and kind, explaining Emma's condition in terms I could understand and outlining a treatment plan that would have her feeling better within days. As I was gathering our things to leave, Emma tugged on my sleeve. "Mama, I need to potty. The specialist's office was in a medical complex I'd never visited before, and while Emma used the restroom, I wandered into the corridor to check my phone. That's when I saw him. David, my husband, walking out of an office 3 doors down with his arm around a woman I didn't recognize. A young woman with glossy black hair and a figure that suggested she'd never carried a child. They were laughing about something, standing closer together than any professional relationship would require. I ducked back into Dr. Rodriguez's waiting room, my heart hammering against my ribs. There could be an innocent explanation. Maybe she was a colleague. Maybe they were discussing a case. Maybe I'd misinterpreted what I'd seen. But even as I tried to convince myself of these possibilities, a deeper part of me knew better. I'd seen the way David looked at her, the easy intimacy in their body language. I'd seen the way his hand lingered on her lower back as they walked toward the elevator. "Mama?" Emma emerged from the bathroom, looking up at me with concern. "Are you sad?" "No, sweetheart," I said, scooping her into my arms. "Mama's just thinking about something." But I was sad, devastated, and underneath the sadness, that clean, bright anger was burning brighter than ever. That evening, after Emma was in bed, I sat at my laptop in our home office and did something I hadn't done in years. I investigated. Not David, not yet, but myself. What had I been doing in the years since I'd given up my consulting business? What skills had I developed? What had I accomplished? The list was longer than David's dismissive assessment had suggested. I'd managed Emma's complex medical needs when she'd had feeding issues as an infant, researching specialists and treatments with the tenacity of an investigative journalist. I'd organized 3 successful fundraisers for Emma's daycare, managing budgets and volunteers and logistics with the precision of an event planner. I'd been treasurer of our neighborhood association, balancing books and preparing reports that would have impressed my former accounting colleagues. I'd also been teaching myself graphic design through online tutorials, initially just to create Emma's birthday invitations, but gradually expanding into more complex projects. I'd designed logos for friends' small businesses, created marketing materials for local nonprofits, built websites for neighbors who needed an online presence. None of this was obsolete or worthless. All of it represented skills that were valuable in the current marketplace. Capabilities that I'd been developing even while David convinced me I was stagnating. Over the next few weeks, I began what I privately called my investigation. Not into David's activities, though I was increasingly certain about what I'd find there, but into my own possibilities. I researched freelance opportunities in marketing and design. I updated my portfolio with the work I'd been doing for friends and neighbors. I reached out to former colleagues and discovered that several were running their own successful consultancies. "Claire, I've been wondering what happened to you," said Angela Morrison, who'd been a junior account executive when I'd left the firm 6 years earlier. "I started my own agency 2 years ago, and I've been looking for someone with your skills. Are you available for contract work?" I was available. More available than I'd been in years, though I couldn't explain why without revealing more about my marriage than I was ready to discuss. But I took the contract, a rebranding project for a local restaurant chain, and threw myself into it with an enthusiasm that surprised me. Working again, even on a small scale, reminded me of who I'd been before David had convinced me I was nobody worth being. I stayed up late after Emma went to bed, designing logos and writing copy, feeling my creativity unfurl like a flower that had been kept too long in darkness. David noticed my renewed energy but interpreted it through his own limited lens. "You seem happier lately," he observed one morning over coffee. "I told you having more structure in your life would be good for you." Structure. As if my newfound purpose was the result of his guidance rather than my own determination to reclaim pieces of myself I'd thought were lost forever. I smiled and didn't correct him. I was learning the value of secrets, of having parts of myself that existed outside his knowledge or control. Every small project I completed, every client who praised my work, every deposit into the separate bank account I'd quietly opened was proof that I was more than the diminished creature he saw when he looked at me. But I still didn't know what I was preparing for. Divorce seemed impossible. David was a lawyer, after all. with connections and resources I couldn't match. And there was Emma to consider, my beautiful daughter who deserved stability even if her mother was slowly suffocating. The answer came, as answers sometimes do, from an unexpected source. I was picking Emma up from preschool when I ran into Sarah Chen, a woman from my prenatal class whom I hadn't seen in over a year. She looked radiant, confident in a way that made me conscious of my own tentative posture. "Claire, how wonderful to see you. How's Emma? How's married life?" "Fine," I said automatically. "Everything's fine. How are you? How's little Michael?" "Thriving. We both are, actually. I got divorced last year." I must have looked shocked because she laughed and touched my arm gently. I know that sounds terrible, but it was the best thing I ever did for both of us. Tom was... Well, let's just say he had very specific ideas about what wives and mothers should be, and I wasn't measuring up. The parallels to my own situation were so obvious I felt exposed, as if she could see through my carefully maintained facade to the truth beneath. "I'm sorry," I said weakly. "Divorce must have been difficult." "The divorce was easy," Sarah said. "It was the marriage that was difficult. But listen, if you ever need to talk about anything, here's my card. I'm a family law attorney now. Made the career change after my own experience with the system." I took her card with hands that trembled slightly, though I told myself I was just being polite. Sarah Chen, attorney at law, specializing in family court and domestic relations. "Thank you," I managed, though I can't imagine needing. "Of course not," she said kindly, "but just in case. Sometimes it helps to know your options, even if you never use them." That night, I hid Sarah's card in my jewelry box, tucked between earrings I never wore, and a necklace from my grandmother. I told myself it was just information, just a safety net I'd never need to use. But safety nets have a way of becoming lifelines when the ground gives way beneath your feet. The confrontation I'd been unconsciously preparing for finally came on a Tuesday evening in late February. David had been working late more frequently, claiming increased pressure from his partners, more demanding clients, the usual ambitious lawyer's litany of excuses. I'd stopped questioning these explanations, partly because I didn't want to know the truth, and partly because his absences had become a relief rather than a disappointment. Emma was in bed, and I was working on a particularly challenging logo design when David walked into the home office where I'd set up my makeshift workspace. "What's all this?" he asked, gesturing at my laptop, the sketches scattered across the desk, the color swatches I'd printed out to compare options. "A project," I said, not looking up from my screen. "For a client." "A client?" His voice carried that familiar note of amused condescension. "Claire, we've talked about this. You're not running a business." "I'm doing freelance work, just small projects." "Without discussing it with me first?" I finally looked up at him, struck by the assumption in his question. I didn't realize I needed permission to use my skills. "Permission?" David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Claire, you don't have skills. You have hobbies. And right now, your hobby is interfering with your responsibilities." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Not the content. I'd heard variations of this dismissal for years. But the timing. He'd chosen this moment when I was finally starting to feel competent and valuable again, to remind me of my place in his carefully constructed hierarchy. "My responsibilities?" I asked quietly. "To this family, to Emma, to me. Instead of playing designer, maybe you could focus on the fact that Emma's been coughing again, or that we're supposed to have dinner with my partners on Friday, and you haven't even confirmed with the babysitter." Emma's cough had been gone for weeks. He would have known that if he'd been home for bedtime stories recently. And I'd confirmed with the babysitter 3 days ago, but explaining either of these facts would mean engaging with his criticism as if it were legitimate rather than manipulative. "I can do both," I said instead. "Take care of Emma and work on projects." "No, Claire, you can't, because you're not good at multitasking. You never have been. You get overwhelmed, you make mistakes, and then I have to deal with the consequences." He was standing behind my chair now, and I could feel the weight of his presence, the subtle intimidation of his height and proximity. This was new. Physical dominance to accompany the psychological control he'd always preferred. "Move away from me," I said, surprising us both with the firmness in my voice. "Excuse me?" "You're crowding me. Move away." For a moment, I thought he might refuse. I could see the calculation in his eyes, the brief consideration of what would happen if he pushed this particular boundary. But even David wasn't quite ready for that level of escalation. He stepped back, but his smile was sharp as a blade. "Fine, but this conversation isn't over, Claire. We need to discuss your priorities, your focus, your understanding of what's actually important in this household." After he left, I sat staring at my laptop screen until the words blurred together. The logo I'd been designing, a phoenix rising from stylized flames for a nonprofit that helped women rebuild their lives, seemed to mock me with its symbolism. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I'd been naive to think that David's affair was a recent development. Once I started looking, really looking, the evidence was everywhere, spanning back at least 2 years. Credit card statements showed charges at restaurants I'd never been to, hotels in cities where he'd supposedly been alone on business, jewelry purchases that had never made their way home to me. His phone, which he'd started guarding with increasing paranoia, contained deleted messages that weren't quite deleted enough for someone with my newfound determination and a few hours of YouTube tutorials on data recovery. Her name was Melissa Santos. She was 28, a paralegal at a competing firm, and judging by her social media presence, she had no idea David was married. Her Instagram was full of photos of romantic dinners, weekend getaways, and gifts that I now recognized from our credit card statements. In her posts, she referred to him as her mysterious businessman boyfriend, who preferred to keep their relationship private for professional reasons. The scope of David's deception was breathtaking. He'd constructed an entire alternate life, complete with a downtown apartment I'd never seen, and a narrative where he was a successful, unmarried attorney exploring his options. Melissa's photos showed the apartment, modern, masculine, expensive, and I realized that some of our home improvements money had probably funded his love nest. But it wasn't the affair that finally broke me. It was the business plan. Hidden in the financial documents I'd been meticulously copying was a folder labeled Future Planning. Inside were projections, timelines, and strategies for what David apparently saw as the next phase of his life. He was planning to leave his current firm and start his own practice. He'd been courting specific clients, developing a business model, even scouting office locations. None of which he'd mentioned to me, his wife, the mother of his child, the person who'd supposedly been his partner for the past 7 years. The timeline was brutally clear. David planned to establish his new practice, secure his client base, and then divorce me. But not until after Emma started school and he could argue for reduced child support. He'd calculated everything: spousal support minimums, custody arrangements, property division. I wasn't his wife in these documents. I was a liability to be managed, an expense to be minimized. The final folder contained something that made my blood run cold. A psychological evaluation he'd commissioned on me, apparently in preparation for a custody battle. The evaluator, a colleague of his I realized, had concluded that I was emotionally unstable, professionally unfocused, and potentially unsuitable for primary custody of the minor child. The evaluation was based entirely on David's testimony. My emotional instability was evidenced by my occasional tears during arguments. My professional unfocus was demonstrated by my departure from the workforce and failure to maintain consistent employment. My unsuitability for custody was proven by my tendency to be permissive and inconsistent in disciplining Emma. Every private moment of vulnerability, every confidence I'd shared, every struggle I'd faced as a new mother had been weaponized against me. David hadn't just been planning to leave. He'd been systematically building a case to take Emma with him. I sat in our home office. His home office, I corrected myself. Surrounded by evidence of my husband's calculated betrayal, and felt something inside me crystallize into diamond-hard resolve. David wanted to play games? Fine. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated his opponent. I'd learned patience during my years of marriage to David, though not the kind he'd intended to teach me. I'd learned to wait, to observe, to carefully consider my moves before making them. Now I applied those skills to the most important project of my life, my escape. First, I secured my evidence. Everything was copied, backed up, stored in multiple locations. Sarah Chen had given me the name of a forensic accountant who specialized in hidden assets, and together we mapped David's financial deceptions with the precision of archaeologists uncovering a lost civilization. The downtown apartment was just the beginning. David had been systematically moving money into accounts I couldn't access, purchasing investments in his name alone, even transferring ownership of some of our jointly held assets to shell companies he controlled. The man who'd accused me of being financially irresponsible had been conducting a masterclass in fiscal manipulation. This is sophisticated stuff, the forensic accountant told me during one of our clandestine meetings. Your husband is either very smart or getting very good advice. Probably both. Can we recover it? I asked. In a divorce? Absolutely. Judges don't appreciate this kind of deception. He's going to pay for trying to hide marital assets. While the financial investigation continued, I began rebuilding my own resources. The freelance work I'd been doing as a creative outlet became a calculated strategy. Every project I completed, every client relationship I developed, every skill I demonstrated was ammunition for the custody battle I now knew was coming. I also began documenting everything about Emma's daily routine, her medical needs, her emotional development. If David wanted to argue that I was an unsuitable mother, he'd have to contend with pediatric records, preschool evaluations, and testimony from caregivers who'd witnessed my devotion to our daughter firsthand. But perhaps most importantly, I began documenting David's absences. Every late night, every weekend business trip, every missed bedtime story or parent-teacher conference. The man who wanted primary custody of Emma had been an absent father for years, and I had the calendar entries to prove it. You're building a strong case, Sarah told me during one of our strategy sessions. But are you sure you're ready for this? David's going to fight dirty. He's going to try to destroy you professionally and personally. Men like him don't accept defeat gracefully. I thought about Emma, about the woman I wanted her to become, about the lessons I was teaching her through my choices. I'm ready, I said. And for the first time in years, I meant it completely. The evening David destroyed my love was a Thursday in late March, unseasonably warm for the season. I'd spent the afternoon playing with Emma in Meridian Park, pushing her on the swings while she shrieked with delight, feeling more peaceful than I had in months. My escape plan was nearly complete. I just needed to choose the right moment to implement it. David came home from work in a foul mood, slamming doors and muttering about incompetent colleagues. He'd been increasingly volatile lately, though I didn't know if this was due to stress from his secret business ventures, guilt over his affair, or simply the natural progression of a man who'd never learned to control his temper. "What's for dinner?" he asked without greeting me or Emma, who ran to show him a picture she'd drawn. "Not now, Emma," he said, brushing past her to pour himself a scotch. "Daddy's had a long day." I watched Emma's face crumple at his dismissal and felt that familiar surge of protective anger. But tonight, for once, I didn't swallow it down or redirect it into people-pleasing. Tonight, I let it burn clean and bright. "Chicken marsala," I said evenly. "Emma, why don't you show Daddy your picture after dinner?" We ate in relative silence, David scrolling through his phone between bites, Emma chattering about her day at preschool, me observing my husband with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a particularly unpleasant specimen. After Emma was in bed, David opened a bottle of wine, an expensive Barolo he'd been saving for a special occasion, though I couldn't imagine what we were celebrating. "We need to talk," he said as we settled in the dining room, our formal table set with the good china for no reason I could discern. "About what?" "About your attitude lately, your behavior, this phase you're going through." phase. As if my growing self-awareness was a temporary condition to be managed rather than a fundamental shift in how I saw myself and our marriage. I'm not going through a phase, David. Really? Because from where I sit, you've been acting like a completely different person. Secretive, rebellious. Frankly, it's getting old. The wine tasted like ash in my mouth, but I took another sip anyway, needing something to do with my hands while he continued his assessment of my deficiencies. I've been patient with this freelance nonsense, he continued, but it's time to refocus on what actually matters. Your family, your real responsibilities. And what are those exactly? David leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never doubted his right to define reality for everyone around him. Being my wife, being Emma's mother, being the kind of partner who supports her husband's career instead of pursuing childish fantasies about being some kind of entrepreneur. The last word dripped with contempt, as if entrepreneurship was a particularly distasteful form of mental illness. I see. And what about your responsibilities, David? What are those? He laughed, actually laughed, as if the question was so absurd it didn't merit serious consideration. I provide for this family. I maintain our lifestyle. I make the decisions that matter. Claire, be honest with yourself. What would you be without me? Where would you be? You'd be living in some studio apartment, struggling to make ends meet, probably working retail or waitressing or some other job for people without real skills. Each word landed like a physical blow, not because I believed them, but because of the venom with which he delivered them. This was David without his mask. David as he truly saw himself and me and our marriage. You think I'm worthless? I said quietly. I think you're exactly what you chose to be when you married me. A wife, a mother. Someone who found a successful man and was smart enough to lock him down before he realized he could do better. The silence that followed his words was deafening. Emma's monitor crackled softly from the kitchen counter, the sound of our daughter's peaceful breathing a stark contrast to the poison filling our dining room. Do better? I repeated. Claire, let's not pretend this marriage is some great love story. You were 28 and desperate when I met you. Your career was stalling, your biological clock was ticking, and you knew you needed someone who could give you the life you wanted. I was a good catch, and you caught me. Congratulations. But don't mistake a successful transaction for some kind of romantic fairy tale. A successful transaction. 7 years of marriage, one beautiful daughter, thousands of shared moments reduced to a business deal where I was the commodity and he was the buyer. And now? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Now you're getting old. You're getting difficult. You're demanding things I never promised to give you. Independence, respect, some kind of partnership that was never part of our arrangement. David paused to refill his wine glass, completely oblivious to the fact that he was delivering his own death sentence with every word. The truth is, Claire, I've outgrown this version of our marriage. I need someone who understands what it means to be with a successful man. Someone younger, more attractive, more supportive. Someone who doesn't question my decisions or pursue ridiculous hobbies or act like she deserves equal say in how our life unfolds. Someone like Melissa Santos, though he didn't say her name. He didn't need to. I've been more than patient with you, he continued, warming to his theme. More than generous. But my patience has limits, and frankly, you're testing them. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop this freelance nonsense. You're going to stop questioning my authority in this house. You're going to remember what your job actually is and do it with gratitude and grace. And if you can't manage that, He shrugged, as if my potential replacement was already waiting in the wings, which of course she was. If I can't manage that, then maybe it's time we both admitted this isn't working anymore. David sat back with the satisfied expression of someone who delivered an ultimatum and expected immediate compliance. He'd shown me exactly who he was, exactly how he saw me, exactly what our marriage meant to him. It was the greatest gift he could have given me, though he'd never understand why. I stood up from the table slowly, my movements deliberately calm despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. David watched me with the lazy confidence of a predator who just cornered his prey, completely unaware that the dynamics in our dining room were about to shift dramatically. "You're absolutely right," I said, walking to the sideboard where I'd placed my purse earlier. "This marriage isn't working anymore." "Good. I'm glad we understand each other." "Oh, we do. For the first time in years, we absolutely understand each other." I opened my purse and withdrew the manila envelope I'd been carrying for weeks, waiting for exactly this moment. David's eyes narrowed as I placed it on the table between us, but he still looked more annoyed than concerned. "What's this?" "Evidence," I said simply. "Evidence of what?" Instead of answering, I opened the envelope and began laying out photographs like a dealer shuffling cards. David and Melissa at dinner. David and Melissa entering his downtown apartment. David and Melissa on vacation in Miami while he'd supposedly been in depositions. I watched his face change as he realized what he was seeing. The arrogant confidence cracked first, replaced by confusion, then alarm, then something approaching panic. "Where did you get these?" "Does it matter?" I arranged the photos in chronological order, a timeline of betrayal spanning nearly 2 years. "There are more, of course. Videos, too. Your girlfriend has quite the social media presence." David lunged forward as if to gather up the photos, but I'd already moved on to the next set of documents. Bank statements showing his secret accounts, property records for the apartment, credit card bills for purchases he'd hidden from me. "Claire, let me explain." "Explain what? That you've been systematically stealing from our marriage to fund your affair? That you've been planning to divorce me for over a year while pretending to want another child? That you commissioned a psychological evaluation of me without my knowledge?" His face went white at the last item. Did you really think I wouldn't find out, David? You married a marketing executive, not an idiot. Though I suppose after years of treating me like one, you forgot the difference. I placed the custody evaluation on the table, followed by the financial projections, the business plans, the timeline for our divorce that he'd mapped out without bothering to inform me. "This is all very impressive," I continued conversationally. "Very thorough, very calculated. You've been planning my destruction for months, haven't you? Maybe years." David had recovered enough to attempt damage control. "Claire, you're overreacting. Yes, I've made some mistakes, but..." "Mistakes?" I laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to cut crystal. "David, this isn't a mistake. This is a systematic campaign of emotional and financial abuse. This is fraud. This is conspiracy. This is a dozen different legal violations that I'm sure your bar association would find fascinating." The mention of the bar association hit home. David's entire identity was wrapped up in his professional reputation, his standing in the legal community. The possibility of disciplinary action was his worst nightmare. "You wouldn't," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Wouldn't I? You just finished explaining that I'm desperate, aging, and utterly dependent on your generosity. What exactly do I have to lose?" I reached into my purse again and withdrew a smaller envelope, this one sealed and addressed to the State Bar's disciplinary board. "This contains copies of everything. Your financial fraud, your abuse of attorney-client privilege in commissioning that evaluation, your use of legal resources for personal vendettas. Should I mail it tonight, or would you prefer to do the honors yourself?" David stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. "Claire, be reasonable. We can work this out. We can go to counseling. We can..." "Work what out? You've made your position crystal clear. I'm worthless. I'm desperate. I'm someone who was lucky to catch you before you realized you could do better. Well, congratulations, David. You're free to do better." I stood up and walked to the window overlooking Meridian Park, where Emma and I had played just hours earlier. The same park where I'd spent countless afternoons pushing her on the swings while David worked late with his paralegal girlfriend. "Here's what's actually going to happen," I said without turning around. "You're going to move out. Tonight. You're going to continue paying the mortgage and utilities on this house while Emma and I live here. You're going to provide spousal and child support at the maximum amounts allowable by law. And you're going to agree to a custody arrangement that reflects your actual involvement in Emma's life, which is to say, minimal. That's absurd. I'll never agree to... You'll agree, I said, finally turning back to face him. Because if you don't, every family law attorney in the city is going to see these documents. Every judge in family court is going to know about your financial deception. Every client you're hoping to bring to your new practice is going to hear about how you tried to destroy your wife and steal your daughter. I walked back to the table and gathered up the photographs, leaving the legal documents spread across the mahogany surface like tarot cards predicting his future. Oh, and David? You might want to call Melissa and let her know she's been dating a married man. I'm sure she'll be thrilled to learn about your little omission. For the first time since I'd known him, David looked truly defeated. The mask of superiority had cracked completely, revealing the weak, frightened man underneath. This was who he'd always been, I realized. Not the confident attorney, but the insecure boy who needed to diminish others to feel powerful himself. Claire, please. We can fix this. I love you. The words that might have moved me even a month ago now sounded hollow, desperate, pathetic. No, David. You love controlling me. You love having someone smaller to make you feel bigger. You love the idea of me. The devoted wife, the grateful dependent, the woman who exists solely to reflect your success. But you've never loved me. I picked up my purse and walked toward the stairs, leaving him alone with the wreckage of his carefully constructed lies. Where are you going? He called after me. To pack your things, I said without looking back. You have 2 hours to be out of this house. After that, I'm changing the locks. David left that night with 2 suitcases and a wounded expression that might have fooled me once, but now seemed like just another performance. He tried one last manipulation at the door, standing on the threshold of the home we'd shared for 4 years, looking at me with what he probably imagined was heartbroken sincerity. I hope you know what you're doing, Claire. I hope you're prepared for what life is going to be like without me. I know exactly what life is going to be like without you, I replied, my hand steady on the doorknob. It's going to be honest. After he left, I sat in our living room, my living room now, surrounded by the evidence of our shared life, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the exhausted quiet that comes after a fight, not the hollow calm of emotional numbness, but genuine peace. The peace of a woman who had finally stopped pretending to be smaller than she was. The divorce proceedings were swift and decisive. David's attorney, a different one from his firm, since his partners had decided his personal drama was becoming a professional liability, tried to fight the settlement terms I'd proposed, but the evidence was overwhelming. Financial fraud, hidden assets, emotional abuse documented through years of emails and text messages I'd been saving without quite knowing why. Your husband made a crucial error, Sarah told me during one of our final meetings. He documented everything. Every disparaging comment about you, every plan to minimize your settlement, every step of his campaign to discredit you as a mother. It's like he kept a diary of his own misconduct. Melissa Santos, when she learned the truth about David's marital status, became an unexpected ally. Apparently, she'd been as deceived as I was, believing David's story about being a divorced father with limited custody of his daughter. When she realized the extent of his lies, she provided additional evidence that strengthened my case and ensured David's reputation in the legal community would never fully recover. Emma, meanwhile, adapted to our new life with the resilience that children often show when toxic dynamics are removed from their environment. She didn't understand why Daddy didn't live with us anymore, but she seemed to sense that the tension in the house had disappeared, that Mommy was happier and more present than she'd been in years. Are we okay, Mama? She asked one evening as I tucked her into bed in our house that no longer felt like a prison. We're more than okay, sweetheart, I told her, smoothing her dark hair away from her face. We're free. 6 months after David moved out, I officially relaunched my consulting business. The client base I'd been quietly building during those final months of my marriage became the foundation for something larger than I'd ever imagined. Within a year, I was employing 3 other freelancers and had enough contracts to move into actual office space. You've built something incredible here, Angela Morrison told me during a business lunch at Chez Laurent, the same restaurant where David had once explained what kind of woman he preferred. I'm honestly amazed by how quickly you've grown. I looked around the dining room where I'd once felt so small, so grateful to be chosen, and marveled at how different everything looked from the perspective of someone who had chosen herself. It wasn't that quick, I said, raising my glass of wine in a toast to my own audacity. It just took me a while to remember who I was. I'm writing this on a Sunday morning in October, sitting at my kitchen table while Emma plays in Meridian Park with my parents, who are visiting for the weekend. The Murano glass chandelier still hangs above the dining room table, but it illuminates different conversations now. Homework sessions with Emma, business planning meetings with my team, dinner parties with friends who see me clearly and love me anyway. David remarried last year, a younger woman from his new firm who reminds me of myself at 28. Ambitious, trusting, eager to please. I hope she's stronger than I was. I hope she runs sooner than I did. But mostly, I try not to think about David at all anymore, except when Emma asks questions about her father that I answer with careful honesty. Emma is thriving. She's confident, creative, unafraid to take up space in the world. Sometimes I catch glimpses of the woman she'll become, and I'm grateful that she'll grow up in a house where female ambition is celebrated rather than diminished, where independence is valued more than compliance. My business is successful beyond anything I imagined when I was sneaking projects between diaper changes and stolen moments of creative freedom. I have employees, colleagues, competitors who respect my work and seek my advice. I speak at conferences, mentor young women starting their own ventures, and wake up every morning excited about the challenges ahead. But perhaps more importantly, I've learned to trust myself again, to value my own judgment, to take up exactly as much space as I need without apologizing for my dimensions. The woman who sat across from David that Thursday evening in March, who listened to him explain her worthlessness with such casual cruelty, that woman knew something her husband never understood. She had been gathering evidence for years, not just of his betrayal, but of her own strength. Every small act of rebellion, every client project completed, every moment of putting Emma's needs above David's convenience had been preparation for the day she would need to stand up and refuse to be diminished any longer. He destroyed my love with words that night, carelessly and deliberately dismantling 7 years of devotion with the surgical precision of someone who had never doubted his right to do so. But I destroyed his world with evidence. Methodical, irrefutable, devastating evidence that turned his careful plans into ash and his assured superiority into the desperate scrambling of a man who had finally been seen for exactly what he was. And in destroying his world, I discovered mine. The truth, as it turns out, really will set you free. But first, it requires you to be brave enough to gather it, smart enough to organize it, and strong enough to use it when the moment comes. My moment came at a dinner table in a house overlooking a park where my daughter plays freely now, unafraid and unashamed of taking up space in the world. It was worth the wait.